Some secrets are never meant to be heard, but sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who changes everyone's destiny. Naomi Carter had mastered the art of becoming invisible. For nearly 8 months, the Black Maid had moved through the Romano estate like a gentle breeze, polishing marble floors that reflected crystal chandeliers, dusting shelves filled with priceless antiques, and quietly slipping out of rooms before anyone noticed she had ever been there. At 29, she understood that invisibility was more than part of her job. It was survival. The mansion stretched across nearly 20,000 square feet overlooking the Hudson River, its stone walls protecting one of the most powerful men on the East Coast. Dominic Romano ruled his empire with calm authority, and every employee knew the same unwritten rule. Never ask questions. Never linger outside closed doors. Never involve yourself in matters that did not concern the staff. Naomi followed those rules with unwavering discipline. She came to work before sunrise, tied back her natural curls beneath a neat scarf, greeted the kitchen staff with a quiet smile, and spent each day making sure every room looked untouched by human hands. She had no interest in power, wealth, or the whispered stories that floated through the hallways after midnight. She only wanted an honest paycheck, enough to help her aging father keep his small home outside Cleveland, and enough to remind herself that difficult seasons eventually passed. That Thursday afternoon seemed no different. Warm sunlight poured through towering windows, painting long golden patterns across the polished hallway, as Naomi carried a basket of fresh linen toward the private conference wing. The corridor was unusually silent. Even the security staff had disappeared from their usual positions. She slowed her pace for only a moment before reminding herself to keep walking. Then she heard it. A voice. Low, careful, almost impossible to make out through the slightly open conference room door. Another voice answered even more quietly, forcing Naomi to pause without realizing she had stopped. She wasn't trying to listen. She wasn't curious. But one sentence drifted into the empty hallway with chilling clarity. The boss will never leave this mansion alive. Naomi's fingers tightened around the basket until the neatly folded towels shifted beneath her hands. Her heartbeat echoed louder than the voices behind the door. She stared at the polished hardwood floor, telling herself to keep moving, to forget what she had heard, to pretend it belonged to someone else. Instead, another voice spoke, calm and confident. Everything is already in place. A cold weight settled inside her chest. She knew she should walk away immediately. Every instinct told her that remaining even 1 second longer could cost her the job she desperately needed. Yet her feet refused to move. The silence inside the room stretched for several long moments before chairs scraped softly against the floor. Naomi finally forced herself forward, her steps measured, her breathing carefully controlled, praying no one had noticed the shadow lingering outside the doorway. She rounded the corner just as the conference room door slowly opened behind her. And for the first time since arriving at the Romano estate, Naomi Carter realized that simply hearing the truth could become the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to her. Naomi kept walking without looking back, but every step felt heavier than the last. The basket of fresh linen suddenly seemed to weigh 50 pounds, pressing against her arms as though it carried the burden of the words she had just heard. She reached the laundry room, placed the towels neatly onto the folding table, and stared at them without seeing them. Her breathing refused to settle. She had worked hard to build a quiet life, one shift at a time, one paycheck at a time, never attracting attention, never giving anyone a reason to remember her name. That discipline had protected her through difficult years, and now, in less than 30 seconds, it threatened to disappear. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself that perhaps she had misunderstood. Perhaps they had been discussing something else. Perhaps the sentence had been part of a joke that sounded darker than it truly was. But another memory surfaced. Immediately, everything is already in place. Those words echoed with calm confidence, leaving little room for innocent explanations. Naomi opened her eyes and looked at the clock mounted above the doorway. It was only 3:20 in the afternoon, yet the day already felt impossibly long. The rest of the staff moved around her as though nothing had happened. Housekeepers exchanged quiet greetings. A chef rolled a cart of fresh pastries toward the dining room. Gardeners crossed the courtyard outside the window with trimmed hedges stacked onto small utility vehicles. Ordinary routines continued with comforting precision. making Naomi wonder if she alone carried knowledge that could change everything. She reached for another stack of folded sheets, trying to force herself back into the rhythm of work, but her hands hesitated. Should she tell someone? The question appeared simple until she considered the answer. Tell who? Every member of the security team answered directly to Dominic Romano. What if one of them had been inside that room? What if the conversation involved someone trusted, someone respected, someone who could smile kindly while hiding dangerous intentions? Reporting the wrong person could place her in even greater danger, and reporting no one at all could leave an innocent man walking towards something he never expected. Naomi had met Dominic only a handful of times during her months at the estate. Their conversations never lasted longer than a few seconds. Good morning. Thank you. Excuse me. He always spoke politely, never raising his voice toward the staff, yet everyone instinctively stepped aside when he entered a room. Authority surrounded him without effort. She remembered one rainy evening when he had quietly handed his umbrella to an elderly groundskeeper before walking through the storm himself. No cameras were present. No guests watched the gesture. He simply did it because someone else needed it more. That memory returned now with surprising force. Whatever people whispered about Dominic Romano beyond these walls, she knew what she had personally witnessed. Respect. Calm. Quiet generosity. Her conscience refused to let her ignore that. She picked up the basket again, determined to continue working until she found the right moment to think clearly. As she stepped into the main hallway, she noticed several black luxury vehicles arriving through the front gate. Security officers immediately adjusted their positions. Expensive suits appeared one after another as important visitors entered the mansion with measured confidence. Something significant was happening that afternoon. Naomi watched from a distance for only a second before lowering her eyes again. But one unsettling thought refused to leave her mind. If the voices behind that conference room door had been telling the truth, whatever was already in place might begin before the sun disappeared beyond the river. Naomi tried to focus on the fresh flowers waiting to be arranged in the grand foyer, but every passing minute tightened the knot in her stomach. The Romano estate had transformed into a place of quiet anticipation. Luxury sedans continued arriving beneath the circular entrance, their polished surfaces reflecting the late afternoon sun. Men and women dressed in tailored suits greeted one another with restrained smiles before disappearing into private meeting rooms. Crystal glasses were lined across silver trays. The dining staff rehearsed every movement, and the head housekeeper reminded everyone that tonight's guests expected absolute perfection. Naomi nodded politely with the rest of the staff, yet her thoughts remained trapped inside the words she had overheard. She carried a vase toward the library, hoping a few moments alone would help her think, when the familiar sound of measured footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Every conversation nearby softened almost instantly. Employees instinctively straightened their posture. Dominic Romano entered the foyer without announcing himself, wearing a charcoal suit that fit with effortless precision. He was tall, composed, and remarkably calm despite the growing activity surrounding him. His expression revealed little, yet his presence seemed to steady the entire room. He greeted the elderly butler by name, thanked one of the gardeners for preparing the courtyard despite the summer heat, and paused briefly to admire the fresh white lilies placed beside the grand staircase. Naomi lowered her eyes immediately, reminding herself that this was not the moment. She should remain invisible. She should continue walking. She should forget everything she had heard. But as Dominic turned toward the east hallway, something inside her refused to stay silent. Before she could reconsider, her feet carried her forward. Every instinct warned her to stop, yet she heard her own voice before she realized she had spoken. Sir. The single word hung in the air. Several members of the household staff froze where they stood. Dominic stopped walking and slowly turned toward her. His expression remained calm, neither irritated nor surprised, simply attentive. Naomi suddenly realized she had broken one of the mansion's unwritten rules. Staff members did not interrupt Dominic Romano unless invited to speak. Heat rushed into her face as every eye in the foyer shifted toward her. The head housekeeper looked horrified. Two security officers immediately stepped closer, exchanging cautious glances. Naomi swallowed, struggling to steady her breathing. I am sorry for interrupting, sir. Dominic waited without speaking. His silence somehow made the room even quieter. Naomi forced herself to continue. Please, do not leave the estate this evening. A faint murmur rippled through the nearby staff. One security officer frowned. Another took another careful step forward. The housekeeper whispered Naomi's name in disbelief, hoping she would stop before making matters worse. Dominic, however, remained perfectly still. His blue eyes rested on Naomi with quiet concentration, studying not only her words but the fear behind them. That is an unusual request, he finally said, his voice calm and measured. Why would you ask me that? Naomi hesitated. Every possible answer seemed dangerous. She could not reveal exactly where she had been. She could not accuse people she had never seen. Yet remaining vague sounded even less believable. Because I believe something is wrong, she answered honestly. I cannot explain everything yet, but I believe someone intends to deceive you. The security officers exchanged another look. One of them spoke firmly. Sir, I recommend we escort her away until we understand what this is. Dominic lifted one hand slightly, and the officer immediately fell silent. His attention never left Naomi. After several long seconds, he spoke again with the same calm tone. Come with me. The simple instruction surprised everyone in the foyer, including Naomi herself. Without another word, Dominic turned toward his private study. Naomi followed several steps behind, painfully aware that every person watching believed her life inside the Romano estate had just changed forever. The heavy wooden door closed softly behind Naomi, sealing away the noise of the mansion and replacing it with an almost unsettling silence. Dominic Romano's private study reflected the same quiet discipline that defined the man himself. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, dark walnut furniture gleamed beneath warm lighting, and a single fireplace flickered gently despite the mild evening outside. Nothing inside the room felt extravagant simply for the sake of appearance. Every detail seemed chosen with purpose. Dominic walked behind his desk, but remained standing, folding his hands loosely in front of him. Naomi stayed near the entrance, afraid to move unless invited. Her heart continued to pound so loudly she wondered if he could hear it. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Dominic finally broke the silence. Take your time, Miss Carter. Tell me exactly what made you stop me in the hallway. His calm voice surprised her. There was no anger, no accusation, only quiet curiosity. Naomi took a slow breath and forced herself to meet his eyes for the first time since she had started working at the estate. This afternoon, I was delivering clean linens to the conference wing, she said carefully. One of the doors was not fully closed. I was not trying to listen, sir. I was only passing by. Dominic nodded once, encouraging her to continue without interrupting. I heard voices inside. I could not recognize who they belonged to. I only heard 2 sentences clearly. She swallowed before repeating the words that had haunted her all afternoon. The boss will never leave this mansion alive. The room became perfectly still. Dominic's expression did not change, but Naomi noticed his eyes sharpen almost imperceptibly. Then another voice said that everything was already in place. She quickly lowered her gaze. That is all I know. I did not stay. I walked away immediately because I was afraid someone would see me outside the door. Another long silence followed. Dominic slowly walked toward the large windows overlooking the river, his hands resting behind his back as he stared at the fading sunlight. He appeared neither shocked nor alarmed. Instead, he seemed to be arranging invisible pieces of a puzzle inside his mind. Naomi began wondering whether she had made a terrible mistake by speaking at all. Finally, he turned back toward her. Did you recognize either voice? She shook her head immediately. No, sir. I wish I had. Did anyone see you near that hallway? Naomi hesitated. I do not think so. Dominic studied her quietly for several more moments. There was something unusual about the way he looked at people. It never felt rushed. It was as though he searched beyond words, measuring honesty through patience rather than pressure. Before he could speak again, the study door opened without warning. Anthony Moretti, the head of estate security, entered with 2 senior officers close behind him. Anthony's face carried obvious concern. Sir, we were informed that a staff member made unusual claims in the foyer. I recommend questioning her immediately. His eyes shifted toward Naomi with unmistakable suspicion. We should also determine why she happened to be near a restricted meeting room. Naomi felt every muscle in her body tighten. Anthony continued before she could respond. With respect, sir, people do not accidentally overhear confidential conversations inside this house. The implications settled heavily in the room. Naomi realized that, in the eyes of security, she was no longer simply a quiet maid. She had become someone whose presence demanded an explanation. Dominic remained silent, his gaze moving from Anthony to Naomi without revealing whose version of the story he accepted. Then, with complete composure, he spoke only 6 words. "Leave her exactly where she is." No one argued, but no one in the room understood what Dominic Romano was truly thinking. Anthony Moretti did not move immediately. His jaw tightened ever so slightly before he nodded with professional restraint and stepped back from the center of the room. The 2 security officers followed him without another word, though neither of them took their eyes off Naomi until the study door closed once again. The silence that returned felt even heavier than before. Naomi stood perfectly still, uncertain whether she should speak or simply wait. Dominic remained composed, his expression impossible to read. After several long moments, he walked toward a small cabinet beside the fireplace and poured himself a glass of sparkling water. He offered another glass to Naomi. She hesitated before quietly accepting it with both hands. "Thank you, sir." Dominic took a slow sip before setting his glass on the desk. "Do you know why Anthony reacted the way he did?" Naomi shook her head. "Because he has protected this house for almost 15 years. His job is to question every unexpected event before it becomes a problem." Naomi lowered her eyes. "I understand." Dominic nodded thoughtfully. "And today, you became an unexpected event." The words were neither cruel nor comforting. They were simply true. Naomi felt her shoulders sink slightly. "I never wanted to create trouble." Dominic studied her calmly. "That is exactly what makes this interesting." Naomi looked up in confusion. Dominic continued. "People who come here with hidden intentions usually speak too much. They try to convince me before I ask questions. You have done the opposite." Naomi remained silent, unsure how to respond. Dominic walked back toward his desk and pressed a single button beneath its polished surface. Within seconds, a discreet monitor rose from inside the cabinet beside him. Several security camera feeds appeared across the screen, each showing different sections of the estate. Dominic selected the conference wing. The recording rewound to earlier that afternoon. Naomi watched nervously as the timestamp approached 3:20. There she was, carrying the basket of clean linens exactly as she remembered. The video showed her slowing near the conference room door before stopping for only a few brief seconds. She never touched the handle. She never looked inside. Then she continued walking exactly as she had described. Dominic replayed the sequence twice without saying a word. He switched to another camera positioned farther down the hallway. The second angle confirmed the same timeline. Naomi entered alone. Naomi left alone. No one approached her afterward. Dominic turned the monitor off and folded his hands once again. "You told the truth about where you were." Naomi released a breath she had not realized she had been holding. Before relief could fully settle in, Dominic asked another question. "Did you tell anyone else what you heard before speaking to me?" "No, sir." "Not another employee? Not a friend? Not family? No one?" Dominic nodded slowly, appearing satisfied by the answer. Yet instead of ending the conversation, he grew even quieter. Naomi noticed his attention drifting toward the conference room schedule lying on his desk. Several names were listed beneath the afternoon meeting. Executives, advisors, senior members of his organization. Familiar names that had worked beside him for years. Dominic's eyes rested on the page longer than expected before he carefully closed the folder. "Miss Carter," he said at last, "sometimes the greatest danger is not the stranger standing outside the gate. Sometimes it is the person everyone stopped questioning a long time ago." Naomi felt another chill travel through her chest. She realized he was no longer considering whether she had overheard something important. He was considering who inside his own trusted circle might have spoken those words. Dominic reached for the telephone on his desk, but paused before lifting the receiver. A faint, thoughtful smile crossed his face for the first time that day. It was not the smile of a man who had dismissed a warning. It was the expression of someone who had quietly decided to begin a test that no one else in the mansion knew had already started. When Naomi stepped out of the study, the atmosphere inside the mansion had changed in ways only someone who paid attention to silence could notice. Conversations stopped a fraction of a second sooner when she walked by. Security officers who had barely acknowledged her during the past 8 months now watched her with careful expressions that revealed nothing. The head housekeeper approached quietly and placed another cleaning schedule into Naomi's hands without asking a single question, but the concern in her eyes was impossible to hide. Naomi understood that rumors traveled faster than facts inside a house this large. She returned to her duties without complaint, polishing the grand staircase railings until they reflected the warm glow of the chandeliers above. She reminded herself that she had done what her conscience demanded. Everything else now rested in Dominic Romano's hands. Across the estate, however, Dominic appeared to behave exactly as everyone expected. He greeted arriving guests with his usual calm confidence. He reviewed financial reports with senior advisors. He even confirmed that the private dinner scheduled for later that evening would proceed without any changes. To everyone watching, nothing had interrupted the carefully planned schedule. Anthony Moretti observed this with quiet satisfaction, believing Dominic had chosen not to overreact to the maid's unusual story. Yet Anthony noticed one small detail that did not fit. Dominic dismissed nearly every member of his security staff for short individual assignments throughout the property, each one receiving different instructions. No one questioned the orders because Dominic rarely explained his decisions. By 6:30 that evening, the mansion appeared perfectly prepared for another elegant gathering. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers. Candlelight reflected across polished marble floors. Servers moved gracefully between the dining room and kitchen carrying silver trays prepared with remarkable precision. Naomi continued replacing fresh flowers inside the east hallway, trying to ignore the uncertainty surrounding her. She expected Dominic to increase security or quietly cancel his evening plans after hearing her warning. Instead, he seemed determined to continue exactly as before. Doubt slowly crept into her thoughts. Perhaps he believed her, but not enough to change anything. Perhaps the evidence had been too weak. Or perhaps she had misunderstood everything after all. As she adjusted the final arrangement of white lilies, she noticed Dominic descending the main staircase. His charcoal suit had been replaced with a midnight blue jacket that matched the quiet confidence with which he carried himself. Several guests greeted him warmly. He smiled politely, accepted their handshakes, and walked toward the dining room as though the afternoon conversation had never happened. Naomi felt her heart sink. Had he ignored her warning completely? She lowered her eyes, disappointed more than afraid. At that same moment, Dominic glanced briefly across the foyer. Their eyes met for only an instant. Without changing his expression, he adjusted the cuff of his left sleeve with deliberate precision before continuing toward his guests. The movement seemed ordinary, almost meaningless, yet Naomi remembered seeing him make that exact gesture inside the study only once before pressing the hidden button that raised the security monitor. A strange feeling settled over her. It was not reassurance exactly, but possibility. Unknown to everyone else inside the mansion, Dominic had already canceled one private meeting, quietly relocated several confidential documents, reassigned trusted personnel to unexpected positions, and instructed his driver to prepare 2 identical vehicles for later that evening. None of those changes appeared on the official schedule. None attracted attention. Every adjustment blended naturally into the rhythm of the estate. To the guests, the evening unfolded exactly as planned. To Naomi, it looked like a man walking calmly toward danger. But somewhere beneath Dominic Romano's composed exterior, an entirely different plan had already begun, and only one person inside the mansion sensed that his greatest weapon was not force, but patience. Naomi continued working through the evening with steady hands, but every passing minute made her heart beat a little faster. The mansion glowed beneath warm golden lights as laughter drifted from the formal dining room. Crystal glasses clinked softly, and the piano continued its elegant melody as though nothing unusual could ever happen inside walls built to project complete control. Guests admired the architecture, complimented the evening meal, and exchanged polite conversation, completely unaware that an invisible test was unfolding around them. Naomi carried fresh coffee service toward the reception lounge, careful to remain unnoticed, yet her eyes instinctively searched for Dominic whenever he entered a room. Each time she saw him, he appeared completely relaxed. He greeted longtime associates, discussed charitable projects with a local business leader, and even paused to congratulate one guest whose daughter had recently graduated from medical school. Nothing in his expression suggested concern. Nothing hinted that only a few hours earlier he had heard a warning capable of changing the entire evening. Anthony Moretti, meanwhile, remained unusually alert. He quietly observed every member of the staff, occasionally glancing toward Naomi with lingering suspicion. She noticed him speaking privately with several security officers before they disappeared into different sections of the estate. Whatever Dominic had ordered earlier had clearly reached only a select few, because even Anthony seemed uncertain why certain assignments had suddenly changed. Shortly after 8 o'clock, one of Dominic's senior advisors approached him carrying a leather portfolio. "Sir, the transportation team is ready whenever you wish to depart." Dominic smiled politely. "Excellent. We will leave exactly as scheduled." Naomi nearly stopped breathing. Leave? She had begged him not to leave the estate. Had he truly decided to ignore everything she had said? She watched from across the hallway as Dominic thanked his guests and announced that he would briefly step away before returning later in the evening. Several visitors nodded without concern. Anthony immediately signaled 2 officers to accompany Dominic toward the front entrance. Naomi stood frozen beside an antique console table, unable to convince herself that remaining silent any longer was the right choice. Just as she considered stepping forward again, she noticed something peculiar. Dominic walked confidently toward the front doors, surrounded by security, yet at the last possible moment, he paused to shake hands with an elderly guest who had quietly entered through the west corridor. The brief greeting lasted only seconds, but during that time the 2 officers assigned to accompany him continued walking ahead toward the waiting vehicles outside. Dominic remained inside the mansion. By the time they realized he had stopped, another man wearing a similar midnight blue jacket had already entered the first vehicle from the opposite side, partially hidden by the open door and evening shadows. The motorcade departed exactly on schedule. Through the front windows, everyone watched the vehicles disappear beyond the gates. Anthony nodded with visible satisfaction, believing Dominic had safely left for his appointment. Naomi stared in confusion. She slowly turned back toward the foyer and nearly gasped. Dominic Romano was still standing inside the mansion behind one of the marble columns, calmly adjusting his cufflinks while watching the departing convoy through the glass. Their eyes met once again. This time he offered the faintest nod, almost imperceptible, before disappearing into a private corridor that only family members and a handful of trusted employees ever used. Naomi suddenly understood. He had never intended to follow the published schedule. The departure everyone witnessed had been meant for someone else to believe. Somewhere beyond the estate, someone was almost certainly waiting for a man who had never actually left the house. And inside the quiet halls of the Romano mansion, Dominic had begun waiting for something far more important than an ordinary meeting. He was waiting to discover who would reveal themselves once they believed their carefully arranged plan was finally unfolding. Naomi remained exactly where she was, hidden behind the arrangement of white lilies as the last of the luxury vehicles disappeared beyond the front gate. The estate suddenly felt different, quieter than before, as though the walls themselves were waiting for something unseen. Guests continued enjoying dessert in the formal dining room, completely unaware that the man they believed had departed was now walking through a private passage behind the library. Naomi lowered her eyes and returned to collecting empty coffee cups, reminding herself that she was still only a housekeeper. Whatever Dominic Romano intended to do next was beyond her place to question. Yet curiosity lingered in every corner of the mansion. Anthony Moretti stood near the entrance reviewing messages on his phone. At first his expression remained confident, but within moments his forehead tightened almost imperceptibly. He stepped away from the guests and quietly answered a call. Naomi could not hear the conversation, only Anthony's changing expression. Calm became confusion. Confusion slowly became disbelief. He ended the call without speaking to anyone and immediately looked toward the front doors where the motorcade had vanished. His eyes searched the driveway as though expecting someone to return. Instead, Dominic Romano emerged from the private corridor behind him. Anthony turned so quickly that he nearly dropped the phone in his hand. For the first time that evening, the experienced security chief appeared genuinely surprised. "Sir," he began before stopping himself. Dominic simply nodded toward the study. "Walk with me." Anthony followed without another question. Several senior advisors noticed the exchange and quietly excused themselves from nearby conversations. One by one, they disappeared into the same corridor. Naomi watched from a respectful distance while continuing her work, sensing that the invisible test Dominic had mentioned was finally reaching its conclusion. Nearly 30 minutes passed before the library doors opened again. This time the atmosphere had completely changed. The advisors who stepped into the hallway no longer carried the relaxed confidence they had displayed during dinner. Some looked thoughtful. Others avoided making eye contact altogether. Anthony remained beside Dominic with noticeably greater humility than before. Whatever had been discussed inside that room had answered questions no one else had even realized existed. Dominic walked calmly into the reception hall, where several longtime associates still gathered beneath the crystal chandeliers. His voice remained measured, never rising above ordinary conversation, yet every person nearby instinctively became silent. "This evening," he said, "I asked many people to trust what they believed they saw." He allowed the words to settle before continuing. Some trusted appearances. A very small number trusted facts. No one interrupted him. Dominic slowly turned toward Naomi, who immediately looked down, assuming he must be addressing someone standing behind her. "Miss Carter." Her name echoed softly through the room. Naomi looked up in surprise. Every guest, every employee, every member of the household had turned toward her. Dominic smiled faintly, not with pride, but with quiet respect. "You chose to speak when remaining silent would have been easier. You reported what you knew without exaggeration, without assumption, and without asking for anything in return." Naomi felt her face grow warm. "I only did what I believed was right, sir." Dominic nodded. "Exactly." He turned back toward the gathering. "The most valuable warning I received today did not come from a security briefing, an intelligence report, or an executive meeting. It came from someone whose only expectation was to tell the truth." The room remained completely silent. Naomi realized that people who had barely noticed her existence that morning were now looking at her with entirely different eyes. She had not become powerful. She had not become important because of wealth or status. She had simply been willing to protect another person without expecting recognition. And inside the Romano estate, that quiet act of integrity had changed far more than anyone could have imagined. The reception hall remained silent long after Dominic finished speaking. No one rushed to fill the stillness with polite applause or unnecessary conversation. The moment felt too genuine for that. Naomi stood quietly beside the flower arrangement, still holding the silver serving tray she had almost forgotten was in her hands. Only that morning, she had expected to finish another ordinary shift, return to her small apartment across the river, call her father before bed, and wake up to do it all again. She had never imagined that simply choosing honesty would place her at the center of a room filled with people whose names appeared on magazine covers and business headlines. Dominic slowly crossed the polished marble floor until he stood only a few feet away from her. Every guest watched with quiet curiosity. Anthony Moretti remained near the doorway, his expression thoughtful rather than suspicious. He lowered his head slightly toward Naomi, a gesture so subtle that most people would have missed it, yet she understood exactly what it meant. Respect had quietly replaced doubt. Dominic looked at the tray, still resting in Naomi's hands, and smiled faintly. "You are still working." Naomi gave a nervous smile. "The coffee cups still need to be returned to the kitchen, sir." A few guests exchanged soft smiles, surprised that after everything which had happened, her first concern remained completing her responsibilities. Dominic nodded with visible appreciation. "That answer tells me more about your character than anything else today." He turned toward the assembled guests. "Many people spend their lives searching for loyalty. Sometimes it is standing quietly in the hallway wearing an apron, asking for nothing except the chance to do the right thing." The words settled gently across the room. There was no dramatic celebration, no grand announcement. Only a simple truth spoken with complete sincerity. Dominic then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small silver access card marked with the Romano family crest. He held it out toward Naomi. She looked at it without moving. "Sir, I do not understand." "Beginning tomorrow," Dominic said, "you will no longer report only to the housekeeping department. If you ever see, hear, or notice something that troubles your conscience, you may come directly to me. No appointments. No permission. No one will stop you." Naomi stared at the card. overwhelmed by the trust behind such a simple object. Slowly, she accepted it with both hands. "Thank you, sir. I hope I never have to use it." Dominic smiled again. "So do I." The tension that had quietly gripped the mansion throughout the evening finally seemed to dissolve. Conversations gradually resumed. Musicians returned to their gentle melodies, and the warm glow of candlelight once again reflected across polished floors. Yet something invisible had changed forever. During the following weeks, Naomi continued arriving before sunrise, arranging fresh flowers, polishing banisters, and greeting every member of the staff with the same kindness she had always shown. She never asked for special treatment, never reminded anyone of that extraordinary evening, and never behaved as though she had become more important than anyone else. The only difference was the way others responded. Security officers greeted her by name. Senior staff listened when she spoke. Anthony occasionally asked for her observations before major events, valuing the perspective of someone who noticed details others overlooked. Dominic himself never mentioned the incident again, but whenever their paths crossed inside the mansion, he acknowledged her with a quiet nod that required no explanation. Respect had never been demanded. It had been earned through integrity, humility, and the courage to speak when silence would have been easier. And on that quiet evening inside the Romano estate, everyone present discovered that the strongest foundation of any great house was never wealth, influence, or reputation. It was the dignity of the people too often overlooked, because sometimes the person who changes everything is the one the world barely notices until the truth gives them a voice.